Cora Whitfield swept the broken glass off her own front porch in the last honey light of a June evening, and she did not cry. Somebody had thrown a bottle at her door. They had wrapped it first in a page torn from the county paper, the one with the headline that called her clinic a danger to the public. The bottle had shattered against the frame. The glass lay across her boards like scattered ice. Cora set down her broom. She knelt, in her plain gray dress, and she picked up the pieces one by one. She dropped them into an old coffee can. Not to keep the anger, to keep the glass. Because glass was useful, and Cora Whitfield had learned a long time ago to save every useful thing, even the things that had been thrown at her in hate. She was 51 years old. She had buried a husband. And the town she had served for 30 years had decided, quietly and all at once, that she was a fraud. You should know how it happened. In the church hall that same summer, before 40-odd of her neighbors, the young county doctor stood up in his clean collar and said it out loud. His name was Lyle Pruitt. He was 34 and city-trained and certain of everything. Bishop Creek doesn't need a widow playing doctor in her kitchen, he said. And the room murmured. Heads nodded. Not one of them stood up. Not one of them asked where that widow had learned to set the barber's shattered wrist the winter before, when the snow closed the road to the city and there was no one else. Nobody asked. That was the whole trouble. Nobody ever asked. There was a black medical bag on a shelf in her kitchen. It had been closed since the day her husband died, 3 winters back. And behind the flour tins on that same shelf there was a framed paper. Turned around, its face pressed to the wall so no one could read it. There was a reason Cora Whitfield's hands were that steady. There was a reason, and this town was going to learn it the hardest way a town can ever learn anything. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something small for me. Subscribe so you don't miss how this one ends. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. The smaller, the better. I want to see how far Cora's story travels. Some of you are watching from places just like Bishop Creek. Places that remember a woman like Cora. Tell me. Then stay with me, because we are going all the way back to the beginning. Bishop Creek sat in a river valley in the green middle of Ohio, and in the summer of 1952, the heat came down into that valley and stayed. The corn stood tall along the county road. The river ran low and brown between its banks. In the mornings the mist hung over the water until the sun burned it off, and by noon the whole town moved slow, the way people move when the air itself feels like a wet wool blanket laid over the shoulders. At the edge of town, past the last streetlight, there was a white frame house with a deep front porch and a picket fence gone soft and gray with age. This was the Whitfield place. For 30 years it had been more than a house. It had been where the country doctor lived and worked. Dr. Samuel Whitfield had delivered half the town in that house. He had set their bones and sewn their cuts and sat up all night with their fevered children. And beside him, every one of those years, had been his wife. They did not call her a nurse then. They called her the doctor's wife, and they said it warm, because they loved them both. When you came up the walk with a sick child in your arms, it was as likely to be Cora who opened the door as Samuel. It was Cora who knew where every bandage was kept. It was Cora whose voice went low and steady when the fever was bad, whose hands never once shook, no matter what she was looking at. The two of them worked like one person. Nobody thought a thing of it. That was just how it was at the Whitfield place. Then, 3 winters back, Samuel's heart gave out. He was reading in his chair by the stove, and he set the book down, and he was gone before Cora crossed the room. She buried him in the churchyard on a gray afternoon, with the whole town standing in the cold. And then something happened that no one planned, and no one quite noticed while it was happening. The town changed her name. Not on paper. in their minds. She stopped being the doctor's skilled partner. She became, simply, the widow. Just the widow, as if the 30 years of steady hands had gone into the ground with her husband. As if she had only ever been standing next to the medicine and never once been part of it. But she went on the same as she always had. That was the thing about Cora. She could not seem to help it. When the Pruitt baby 3 farms over got the croup, it was Cora who came in the night with her steam. When old Mr. Halloran was dying slow of his lungs that last winter, it was Cora who sat with him, evening after evening, so his daughter could sleep. She asked for nothing. She never once presented a bill. She kept a coffee can on the kitchen shelf. A different can from the one she'd later fill with broken glass, and in it were small slips of paper. $1 here, $2 there. The little debts of half the valley, for salves and splints and long nights, debts she wrote down only so she wouldn't embarrass anyone by asking twice. And then, never collected at all. When a family finally pressed money into her hand out of shame, she took the coin, and she found a way to leave more than that behind on the way out. A jar of preserves. $1 tucked under the sugar bowl for the children. She could not be paid. It was almost a fault in her. It drove the proud ones half crazy. You are going to want to remember all of this. Remember that she was good. Remember it, because in a little while this town is going to be cruel to her, and I need you to feel exactly how little she did to deserve it. Because here is how the cruelty started, and it did not start with grief alone. 2 years before that summer, there was a family out past the mill, and their little girl took a fever. It came on fast, the way things did with children in those days. The family sent for Cora, and Cora came, and she looked at the child, and she did not like what she saw. She told them, plain and low, that this was past what her kitchen could do. She told them to take the girl to the city, to the hospital 40 miles off, and to go now, that night, not in the morning. She said it more than once. But the road to the city was long and dark, and the family had no money for a hospital, and they were afraid. Afraid of the cost, afraid of the distance, afraid of what going meant. So they waited. They gave the child the tonics they had in the house. They waited for the fever to break on its own, the way fevers sometimes did. And in the morning, when they finally hitched the wagon, it was too late. The little girl died on the road to the city, in her mother's arms, with the sun coming up. Grief has to land somewhere. It cannot just hang in the air. And the mother, half out of her mind with it, said the thing that grief says. She said the widow's kitchen cures had kept them home too long, that if they'd never called the widow at all, they'd have gone straight to the real hospital and their girl would be alive. It was not true. Cora had begged them to go. But nobody was in that room but the family, and grief does not remember accurately, and the mother needed it to be someone's fault that was not her own. And there was a man in town who found that story useful. His name was Emmett Doss, and he ran the druggist's shop on Main Street, and he sold patent tonics off a shelf behind the counter. Bottles with grand names and grander promises, $1.25 each. For years those tonics had sold slow, because half the valley just went to Cora, and Cora gave them what worked and charged them nothing. It galled him. A free remedy that beat his paid one, you cannot put that in a ledger, but a man feels it. So when the grieving mother's story came through his shop, Emmett Doss did not let it die. He repeated it. He shaded it. To this customer and that one, over the counter, low and confidential, he'd say, a version of it. You heard about that poor child, didn't you? Kept home by the widow's cures. He never quite said the words himself. He just kept the story warm and passed it along, again and again, until a lie that had started in one grieving woman's mouth got said so many times by so many mouths that it hardened into a fact. That is how a fact gets made in a small town. Not all at once. Drop by drop, over a counter, until the water wears the stone. And Cora, this is the part that will make you want to shake her, Cora never said one word to defend herself. Not one. She heard the story going around. She was not a fool. She knew what Doss was doing. And she let it stand. Some of it was pride, some of it was grief of her own. But some of it, and this is the truth of her, was that a small part of Cora Whitfield had started to believe them. A part of her that had gone quiet when Samuel died wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe she had only ever been his hands. Maybe without him she was just a widow playing at medicine after all. So, she let the framed paper stay turned to the wall. She let them make her the town's cautionary tale. And she went on splinting wrists and breaking fevers in the dark, taking their scorn in one hand and giving them her help with the other, as if the two things had nothing to do with each other. You could watch it happen if you knew where to look. That winter, the barber, Cal Simmons, slipped on the ice behind his shop and came down hard on his wrist, and it bent the wrong way, ugly and swelling. The road to the city was snowed shut. He came to Cora's porch, because there was nowhere else, and the pain had beaten the pride out of him. And Cora sat him at her kitchen table, and she felt along the bones with those steady hands, and she talked to him low the whole time so he wouldn't tense, and she said it. She said it clean, the way you'd have to know how to do, and she splinted it with a thin board and strips of clean sheeting. And she told him how to hold it and when to come back. Cal's wrist healed straight. It healed perfect. He used that wrist to cut hair for 20 more years. And do you know what he told people when they asked how his wrist got better? He said he'd let it rest, and it came around on its own. He could not quite make himself say the widow said it. It was easier not to. That is what she was up against. They used her hands, and then they went home and told the story, with her hands cut out of it. There was a girl who saw a piece of the truth without knowing what she was looking at. Her name was Junie Marsh. She was 17 that summer, all elbows and worry. With a little brother named Petey, she half raised herself, because their mother worked and their father was gone. Junie had grown up on the town's talk. She believed every word of it. To Junie, the widow at the edge of town was a slightly frightening figure. An old woman who meddled in things and maybe, if you believed the story, had once let a child die. So when Junie's mother sent her out to the Whitfield place one afternoon, that June to return a dish, Junie went with her chin up and her guard high, the way you'd go past a graveyard. But the house was just a house. It smelled of bread and camphor. Cora took the dish with a soft thank you and went to wrap up some cornbread to send back, because of course she did, and while Junie stood waiting in the kitchen her eyes wandered the shelves the way a young person's eyes do. Flour tins, rows of clean jars, rolled bandages, and behind the flour, tipped against the wall, the back of a picture frame. Just the brown paper backing and the little wire, turned around so you couldn't see the front. Some old paper, Junie thought. Some certificate for a jam contest, maybe, or a marriage license, turned around because the glass caught the light. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Then Cora came back with the cornbread warm in a cloth, and Junie forgot the turned-around frame entirely. She would not think of it again for weeks. You, though, you are going to remember it. There was one more thing, and it happened so fast that only you and I will catch it. A neighbor woman was in Doss's shop that same week, buying a bottle of something for her husband's stomach. And Doss measured out the dose and told her how much to give and how often. And Cora happened to be at the counter, buying thread, saying nothing, keeping to herself the way she did in town now. And she heard the dose Doss gave. And it was wrong. Not wildly wrong, but enough. Enough to do a grown man harm over a week. And Cora Whitfield, without lifting her head, murmured the right amount under her breath, half to herself, the correct figure, quiet as a prayer. Doss didn't hear it. The neighbor didn't hear it. Nobody in that shop heard the widow quietly fix the druggist's mistake and save a man a bad week. But it happened. Her hands and her head knew things that a woman playing doctor in her kitchen has no business knowing. And the whole town walked past it every day and never once asked the only question that mattered. Where did she learn all this? Where does a country doctor's widow get hands like that? They were about to ask. But they were going to ask it too late, and they were going to ask it on their knees. It came to a head at the church hall. The county had appointed a new physician that spring, young Dr. Lyle Pruitt, fresh from the city with his framed degrees and his clean instruments and his firm ideas about the modern way. Pruitt believed in credentials. He believed that healing was a thing you got a paper for, and that anyone without the paper who touched a sick person was a menace. He had heard about the widow at the edge of town before he ever met her. He had heard the story of the child on the road. And he had made up his mind about Cora Whitfield without laying eyes on her, the way certain men do. The meeting was billed as a public health talk. 40-some neighbors came, fanning themselves in the June heat, sitting on the hard church hall chairs. Doss was there in the front, nodding along, and partway through, Pruitt got to the subject he'd been building toward all evening. Unlicensed medicine, he called it, the danger of untrained persons treating the sick. And then he said the thing. He stood there in his collar, and he said, "This town doesn't need a woman playing doctor in her kitchen." He did not say her name. He did not have to. Every head in that room knew who he meant, and the murmur that went around was not a murmur of protest. It was agreement. It was relief, almost relief, that the young doctor had said out loud the thing they'd all been half thinking. Doss nodded hardest of anyone. Cora was not even in the room to hear it. But it got back to her by nightfall, the way everything does in a town that size. A woman playing doctor in her kitchen. That was the sentence. Hold on to it. Set it somewhere in the back of your mind, and don't let go of it. Because a day is coming when that exact sentence is going to come back around and stand in the middle of this town and be judged. And it will not be Cora who is found wanting. After the meeting, things moved fast, and they moved ugly. Pruitt wanted the widow's clinic shut down, formally, on paper. Doss wanted it too, for his own reasons, though he dressed his reasons up in concern for the public. Between the two of them they pushed the town council, and the council, tired, hot, unwilling to make enemies of the doctor and the druggist over a widow nobody would stand up for, did what councils do. They posted a notice. An official notice, tacked up on the board outside the feed store where everyone would see it, forbidding the unlicensed practice of medicine within the township. It did not name her. It did not have to. Everyone knew. And then, a few nights later, somebody with more hate than sense wrapped a bottle in that newspaper page and threw it through the dark at her porch. Which brings us back to where we started, to Cora on her knees in the honey-colored evening, in her plain gray dress, picking the broken glass off her own boards one piece at a time and dropping it in a coffee can. She read the headline on the newspaper the glass had been wrapped in. She folded the paper up small and set it aside, not crumpled, just folded, the way you'd put away something you meant to remember. She looked at the turned-around frame behind the flour tins through the kitchen window, its face still to the wall. And Cora Whitfield made a decision. She decided they were right. Or at least she decided to stop fighting a thing she had never really fought in the first place. That night she closed the clinic. She put away the bandages. She let the porch light go dark. She would sit with no more dying men and break no more children's fevers. If the town did not want the widow's hands, the town could do without them. She was tired. She was 51 and alone and tired, and she folded up her whole gift and put it on a high shelf next to a closed black bag and a paper turned to the wall, and she told herself it was for the best. The town got what it asked for, and then, 3 weeks later, the town got what it deserved. and it came for their children. It started with a farm child out past the river. A boy, 7 or 8, who came in from chores one evening with a headache and a stiff neck and a fever that would not come down. The family thought it was the summer grip. By the 3rd day, the boy could not lift his own arm off the bed. Word went quiet around the valley, the way frightening word does. And then it was not one child. It was a child on the next farm. And then a little girl in town, the postmaster's daughter, and then 2 more, and by the middle of July, the thing had a name that every mother in Ohio was afraid to say out loud. Polio, the summer plague. The one that came in the hot months and took the strong ones and the small ones and left them locked stiff in their own bodies, or worse. You have to understand what that word did to people in 1952. There was no shot yet. There was no cure. There was only fear, and the fear was total. Mothers kept their children in. The swimming hole stood empty in the heat. The church stopped passing the collection plate hand to hand. And the sickness did not care about any of it. It moved through Bishop Creek that July like something with a will. The county hospital was 40 miles off, in the city, and it filled up fast because it was not just Bishop Creek. The whole region was in it. The hospital had an isolation ward, and the isolation ward had a certain number of beds and a certain number of iron lungs, those great steel tanks that breathed for a child when the child's own chest muscles quit. And there were not enough. There were never going to be enough. So the hospital did what institutions do when there is not enough. It set terms. $22 a week for a bed in the isolation ward. And if the child was out here in the valley and had to be carried the 40 miles in, $200 for the ambulance run. $22 a week. $200 for the ride. In a valley where a farm family might see $200 of actual cash across a whole year, where half the town owed Cora Whitfield $1.25 she'd never collected. Those numbers were a locked door. Those numbers meant that for a lot of families in Bishop Creek, the modern hospital with its credentials and its iron lungs might as well have been on the moon. And young Dr. Pruitt, the man who had stood in the church hall and warned them all against kitchen medicine, was suddenly the only credentialed hand in the whole valley, and he was drowning. He did his best. Believe that. He was not a wicked man, only a certain one, and his certainty was about to fail him worse than any wickedness could. Pruitt treated the polio the way his city training told him to treat it. When a limb went painful and rigid, the standard care, the modern care, was to hold it still, to splint it, to cast it, to immobilize the seizing muscle so it could rest, and wait. That was the orthodox medicine of the day, taught in the best schools, and Pruitt believed in it the way he believed in his own name. And the children locked stiff, one after another, under the plaster and the splints. The muscles the polio had attacked drew up tight and hard and stayed that way. A leg curled and would not come back. A foot pointed down and set like that, frozen, an arm bent at the elbow and turned to wood. Pruitt was doing everything right by his book. And the valley's children were going stiff anyway, in casts, one after another, and there was a clock running that he understood too late, a threshold, somewhere around the 4th day of the fever, after which whatever position the muscle had seized in was the position it would keep for the rest of that child's life. Cast a curling limb still, and wait, and let the 4th day pass. And the curl is permanent. That was the thing about the standard care that no one in Bishop Creek yet understood. It was a race, and the modern medicine was running it backward. There was a woman at the edge of town who knew that. There was a woman with a paper turned to the wall who knew exactly what that clock was and exactly how to beat it. But her porch light was dark, and her clinic was closed by order of the county, and nobody in Bishop Creek was going to go crawling to the widow they'd thrown a bottle at. Not while there was any pride left in them at all. And there was still, for a little while longer, some pride left. In the middle of all this, A letter came for Cora. It came in the regular mail, an ordinary envelope, and she brought it in from the box and opened it at her kitchen table in the evening light. And for just a moment, before she folded it away, the front of that letter was visible. There was a letterhead. It was from a clinic in Minneapolis, far away, up in Minnesota. And there were a few words on it that meant nothing to anyone in Bishop Creek, but that are going to mean everything to you. The word Kenny. And the words Certificate of Instruction and a year 1943. Cora read whatever it said. Her face did something complicated and quiet. And then she folded the letter in half, and in half again, and she put it away in a drawer. And she sat for a long time in the dark kitchen, with her hands folded on the table. 1943. The war years. While her husband held down the country practice alone, Cora Whitfield had gone away for a season, up north, to a clinic run by a woman named Kenny, and she had trained in a method. A method for exactly this. A method of treating the seizing muscles of polio, not with plaster and stillness, but with heat and motion, hot wool packs, wrung out and laid on the burning muscles to loosen them, and then the slow patient coaxing of the limb back to life before the fourth-day clock ran out. It was a method the orthodox doctors of America mostly sneered at. They called it unscientific. They called it, some of them, quackery, the very word Doss had pinned to her over his counter. Cora had brought that training home to Bishop Creek and used it quietly at her husband's side and never once made a show of it, and then Samuel had died, and the town had decided she was nobody, and she had let the certificate turn its face to the wall and half believed them. She was, it turned out, one of the few people in the whole valley who actually knew how to fight the thing that was now eating their children. And she was sitting alone in a dark kitchen, forbidden by law to lift a hand. Something in Cora had changed by the time she folded that letter away, though. You could feel it if you were in the room. The tiredness was still there. But under it now was something harder. Not quite hope. Something more like resolve, waiting for a reason. The reason came knocking a few nights later, and it had a small, frightened face. The Marshes had it now. Petey, Junie's little brother, 8 years old, had come in from the yard 3 days back with the headache and the stiff neck, and Junie had known, the second she saw him, with a sick, certain dread. Their mother had done the only thing she knew to do. She had gotten Petey to the county hospital, 40 miles over the dark roads, on a borrowed truck. And at the hospital they had looked at the boy, and they had told the Marshes the terms. $22 a week. $200 for the bed to even be held, given how full the ward was, given how many were ahead of him. And the Marshes did not have $22, let alone $200. They did not have it, and they could not get it, and there was no one to get it from. And so the modern hospital, with its iron lungs and its credentials, turned the Marsh family around at the door and sent them home. Sent them back down the 40 miles of dark road with their stiffening boy, because they were poor. It was the 3rd day of Petey's fever when they got him home. You remember about the 4th day. Junie remembered nothing about any clock because Junie did not know there was one. All Junie knew was that her little brother, who she had half raised, was burning up and could not move his right leg the way he should, and that the hospital had shut its door in their faces, and that their mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her face in her hands. All out of ideas, all out of hope, all out of everywhere left to turn. And Junie Marsh, 17 years old, raised on every cruel story the town ever told about the widow at the edge of the world, sat in that failing kitchen and thought of the one porch light in Bishop Creek that she had not yet tried. The dark one. The one nobody was supposed to go to anymore. The house that smelled of bread and camphor, with an old turned-around picture behind the flour tins that she had looked at for 2 whole seconds one afternoon in June and forgotten. Junie thought of the widow. Everything the town had put in her head said don't. said that woman is a fraud, that woman is forbidden, that woman is the last resort of fools. But it was the middle of the night, and her brother was slipping away by the hour, and there was nowhere else left in all the world to go. So Junie Marsh got up. She wrapped Petey in a blanket. And she carried her stiffening little brother out into the July dark, down the empty valley road, all the way to the edge of town, to the dark house behind the gray picket fence. And she went up the walk where the glass had been swept away weeks before, and she stood on the widow's porch in the middle of the night, and she raised her fist, and she knocked. For a long moment, nothing. The house stayed dark. The crickets went on in the corn. Junie's heart pounded. She knocked again, harder, and she heard herself saying, "Please, please," out loud to a closed door. And then a light came on inside. And footsteps. And the door opened, and there stood Cora Whitfield in her nightdress, with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, her gray hair down, her face still creased from the pillow. She looked at the girl on her porch. Then she looked down at the bundle in the girl's arms, at the small face flushed with fever, at the leg held so strangely stiff, and Cora Whitfield went very still. She did not say, "I told this town so." She did not say, "Your kind threw a bottle at my door." She did not say one single word about any of it. She just looked at that sick boy for a long, long moment in the porch light, and Junie watched something move across the old woman's face. Something like a door swinging open after 3 years shut. Then Cora stepped back and held her own door wide. "Bring him in," she said. "Bring him to the kitchen. Quick now." And she turned, and she walked to the shelf above the counter, past the flour tins, past the turned-around frame, and she reached up with both hands, and she lifted down the black medical bag. Her husband's bag. The bag that had been closed since the winter afternoon he set down his book and died. 3 years it had sat there, latched, untouched, a monument to a man and a life that was over. Cora set it on the kitchen table in front of the frightened girl and her fevered brother. She looked at it for one breath. And then, for the first time since she had become just the widow, Cora Whitfield reached out and unsnapped the latch and opened the black bag wide. Inside that bag was 30 years of a good man's work. Cora's hands knew every piece of it: the stethoscope, the little bottles, the scissors, the forceps, the rolled bandages gone soft with age. But she wasn't reaching for any of that. She was reaching for what she carried in her own head, and had carried for 9 years, folded away like the certificate on the shelf. She looked at Junie. "Put him on the table. Gentle. Mind that leg." Junie laid her brother down. Petey's eyes were half open, glassy with the fever. His right leg lay stiff as a fence rail, the foot turned in, the muscle in the calf drawn up hard as a knot of rope. Cora put 2 fingers on it. She pressed. The boy whimpered. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days, Junie said. "The fever started Tuesday. The doctor put a splint on it. He said keep it still. Keep it flat and still, and don't let him move it." Cora's mouth went thin. "Of course he did," she said, but not to the girl. She said it to the room, to the years, to the young man 40 miles off who trusted his casts. Then she straightened. "Junie, listen to me now. I need wool, old blankets, a wool coat, anything you find in that chest by the door. I need my 2 big kettles filled and on the stove. And I need you to stop being afraid, because I cannot use a girl who's afraid. Can you do that?" Junie wiped her face. "Yes, ma'am." "Then go." And so it began, in the middle of the night, in a kitchen the town had decided was a place of quackery. Cora tore the wool into wide strips. She set the kettles boiling. And when the water rolled, she dropped the wool in with a long wooden paddle. And she let it steep, and then she hauled it up steaming and wrung it out between 2 boards till the water ran back into the pot. Just short of scalding. She'd burned her own wrists learning that line in Minneapolis, in a ward full of iron beds and crying children, in the winter of 1943. Too hot, and you blister the child. Too cool, and you waste the hour. There was a right heat, and her hands remembered it. She laid the first pack along Petey's drawn-up calf. The boy cried out and tried to pull away. Junie moved to hold him, but Cora spoke low and steady, close to his ear. I know, sweetheart, it's hot. But that hot is going to loosen what's tied up in there. You let it work. You just breathe and let it work. They packed the leg from ankle to hip. Then the other leg, for it was starting too, though slower. Then a strip across his low back, where the doctors never thought to look. And when a pack cooled, they pulled it and dipped a fresh one, and laid it on again, and again, in shifts, hour after hour, while the sky outside stayed black and the crickets sawed in the corn. Junie's arms ached, her eyes burned for sleep. But somewhere past 2 in the morning she stopped being a frightened girl and became a pair of hands, wringing wool, passing packs, holding her brother's damp head. Cora worked beside her without a wasted motion, and between the packs she did the other thing, the thing no splint could do. She took Petey's stiff foot in both her hands, and slow, so slow, she moved it. Bent the ankle, turned it out, coaxed the knee, talked to the muscle like it was a scared animal that had forgotten how to be a leg. You don't lock it down, she said, half to Junie, half to herself. That's the whole lie of it. You don't lock it down, the muscle's in spasm. You leave it splinted, and it seizes stiff and it forgets, and by the 4th day it's forgotten for good. But you keep it warm, and you keep it moving, gentle, before that door shuts, and it remembers. It remembers it's a leg. Junie stared at her. How do you know all this? Cora didn't look up from the foot. Because a woman in Minneapolis taught me. A long time ago, when your grandmother still thought I was somebody. By the gray of first light, Petey's fever had broken into a sweat that soaked the sheet, and Cora took his foot one more time and said, Push against my hand, Petey. Just a little. Push like you're stepping on a bug. And the foot moved. The toes curled down, small, weak, trembling, but his own, and on command, on the 3rd day going into the 4th, the very hour the door should have been swinging shut. Junie made a sound that was half laugh and half sob and pressed her hand over her mouth. Cora sat back on the kitchen chair. She was 51 years old, and she had been up all night, and her back was a solid bar of pain. She looked at the boy's moving foot for a long moment. And she didn't say a word about the town, or the meeting, or the bottle through her door. She just reached over and pulled the sweat-damp hair off the boy's forehead, the way she'd done for 100 children in this kitchen, back when they let her. He'll walk, she said quietly. He'll want watching for weeks. But he'll walk. Junie was crying openly now. Why did you help us? After what we all, Cora looked at her. Something old and tired crossed her face. Because he's 8, she said. And I have a pair of hands. That's the whole of it, child. That was always the whole of it. Word travels a small valley by daylight. It also travels by dark, the back way, mother to mother, over fences and back porches. In the low voices people use for the things the town says are shameful. By the next night there was another child on Cora's table. A farm girl, 6 years old, one arm gone stiff at the shoulder. The ward 40 miles off had casted her and sent her home because the iron lungs were spoken for, and she could still breathe on her own. Her father stood in Cora's kitchen turning his hat in his hands, and he couldn't quite look at her, because he was one of the 40-odd who had murmured agreement at the church hall in June. Doss said, he started. I know what Doss said, Cora told him. Put your girl on the table. And the daylight went on the way daylight does. Down on Main Street, Emmett Doss stood behind his counter with his bottles of tonic and his ledger, and he told the men who came in for their morning coffee that it was a scandal, a plague on the town and the widow out there meddling in it, playing doctor again, and somebody ought to tell the council. And the men nodded, because it was easier to nod at Doss than to say out loud that their own cousin's boy had a foot that moved again. That was the whole strangeness of it. The town's mouth went on saying quackery, while the town's children went, one by one, in the dark, to the quack. On the third such night, an old woman came. She sat in the corner while Cora worked, a grandmother brought along to hold a fretful baby, and she watched Cora's hands wring the wool and lay the packs and coax the little limb. And after a while she said, in a wondering voice, "I know you." Cora didn't look up. Most people do. "I'm the widow." "No," the old woman said. "No, before that. You were the nurse. You ran Dr. Whitfield's surgery. 30 years you ran it. When my Harold cut his hand to the bone at the mill, it was you sewed it. Not the doctor, because the doctor's own hands shook by then, and everyone knew it and nobody said it. It was you." She shook her head slowly. "I'd forgotten. Lord forgive me, the whole town forgot. How does a town forget a thing like that?" Cora's hands stilled for just a second on the wet wool. Then they went on. "It forgets," she said, "because forgetting was easier than paying me." But something had shifted in the room, and she felt it. The town's own memory, coming back through the town's own mouth. One old woman in a corner, remembering out loud who Cora Whitfield really was. It couldn't stay quiet. Nothing that saves children ever stays quiet for long. On the fourth night, the knock at the door was not soft, and it was not a frightened girl. Cora opened it to find Dr. Lyle Pruitt on her porch, 34 years old and gray in the face with 3 weeks of a losing fight, and behind him the council's notice in his fist, the one forbidding unlicensed practice. Behind him, too, hanging back by the gate, was Emmett Doss, who had done the reporting and hadn't the stomach to come to the door. "Mrs. Whitfield," Pruitt's voice was tight. "You've been warned once already. There's a statute. You are practicing medicine without a license, in the middle of a public health emergency, and I am here to—" He stopped. Because the door had swung wide as he spoke, and he could see past her into the lamplit kitchen, and on the table lay a boy of 7, and Pruitt knew that boy. He'd casted that boy himself, not 8 days back, an arm and a shoulder locked in plaster, sent home to keep still. The cast was gone now. It lay split on Cora's counter where she had cut it off, and the boy, under the steaming wool, was slowly, on the whispered count of a 17-year-old girl, curling his fingers open and shut. Open and shut. The fingers that the cast said would not. Pruitt stood in the doorway and did not finish his sentence. "Come in or stay out, doctor," Cora said. "But shut the door either way. I'm keeping the heat in." He came in. He couldn't help it. He walked to the table like a man walking in his sleep, and he looked down at the child's moving hand, and Cora watched the certainty crack behind his eyes. She had seen that crack before, in Minneapolis, in the faces of Orthodox men who'd sworn casts were the only way, right up until they saw a packed limb move. "This is—" He started. "This isn't, the immobilization protocol is the accepted protocol is locking these children stiff," Cora said. She kept her voice low. Because the boy was listening. "You cast a muscle in spasm, and you hold it there past the 4th day, and it seizes for life. I've watched it. You've watched it too these 3 weeks, only you called it the disease doing it instead of the splint. It's not the disease that steals the walking, doctor. Some of it is us. Some of it is what we do while we wait. You can't know that. You've no training to. I trained at the Kenny Clinic in Minneapolis in 1943. She said it flat and plain, the way you'd state the weather. Hot packs and re-education of the muscle. I've done it for children through a whole ward. I've got the certificate of instruction on that shelf, turned to the wall, because this town made me ashamed to hang it. But I did the training. And you did not. So don't you stand in my kitchen and tell me what I can't know." The room was very quiet. The boy's fingers went open and shut, open and shut. Pruitt's pride was still there. She watched him grab for it. "The law is the law," he said, "but weaker now. You are not licensed to." "Then arrest me," Cora said, "and go home and cast the rest of them stiff. And answer to their mothers in 20 years when they can't hold a spoon. You do that, doctor. You go right ahead." He didn't move. He couldn't. And into that silence, from the corner where she'd been holding a lamp, Junie Marsh spoke up, because Junie could not stand it one more second. "She's not what they say," Junie said. Her voice shook, but she said it. I believed it too. My whole life I believed it. That she was a fraud and she got a child killed. Everybody said. Doss said. She looked at Cora. "But that's not even true, is it? That story. It's not even true." And there it was, the wound at the bottom of all of it, dragged up into the lamplight at last. Cora went still. She had never spoken of it. 3 years she had let it stand, because defending yourself against grief only looks like guilt. But the girl had asked her straight, in front of the doctor, over a healing child, and something in Cora let go. "No," she said. "It's not true." She sat down slow in the kitchen chair. She looked at her own hands. "There was a child," she said, 2 years ago. A little girl, burning up, and her people brought her to me the way they brought their trouble to me for 30 years. And I looked at her, and I knew it was past me. It was past this kitchen. I told them, I begged them, take her to the city tonight. Tonight, I said. Don't wait for morning. This needs the hospital, and it needs it now. She drew a breath. And they were poor, and they were scared, and the city was 40 miles and $200 they didn't have, and they waited. They waited till morning, hoping the fever would turn. It didn't. She died on the road. Cora's voice didn't break, but it went very quiet. And the mother, grief does terrible things to a person, the mother needed it to be somebody's fault that wasn't her own. So she said the widow's kitchen cures held them up. And Emmett Doss, who'd been losing tonic money to my free remedies for years, Emmett Doss took that story, and he watered it, and he fed it, and he walked it up and down Main Street till it grew roots. And I never said a word. Because, what do you say? You can't argue with a mother who buried her child. So, I let them have it. I let them make me the reason. She looked up at Junie. But I told that family to run for the city. I said tonight, the delay was fears, and it was the roads, and it was $200 nobody had. It was never mine. Junie stood there, with tears running down and her lamp shaking, and everything she had ever believed about the widow at the edge of town came apart in her hands. And Pruitt heard all of it too. Heard the whole shape of the injustice he'd added his own weight to, at the church hall, in front of 40 neighbors, when he'd said, this town doesn't need a woman playing doctor in her kitchen. He looked at the notice crushed in his own fist. He looked at the boy's moving hand. He did not apologize. He was not the kind of man who could. Not yet. Not that night. But he folded the notice and put it in his coat, and he said, stiff as his own casts, I have a child at the ward tonight. A bad one. The breathing's failing and the lungs spoken for, and I've done everything I know. He stopped. I've wired the state for help. A health officer's coming. Renner, tomorrow, maybe. Then he'll see for himself, Cora said. Pruitt nodded once, and out on the porch, when he passed Emmett Doss still hanging by the gate, the druggist said, Lo, well? You shutting her down? And Pruitt looked at him for a long moment and said, Go home, Emmett, and walked off into the dark. Dr. Renner came the next afternoon, and the town gathered where towns gather. In the church hall, the same 40-odd faces that had murmured in June, called together now because the emergency had grown too big for whispering. He was a broad, tired man, the state health officer, and he'd spent his morning in Pruitt's ward among the iron lungs and the casts. And then he'd spent an hour, at Pruitt's own strange insistence, out at the Whitfield house. He'd looked at Cora's charts, for she kept charts, in a clean hand, the temperatures and the pack times, and the daily measure of every limb's return. He'd watched Petey Marsh walk across the kitchen. He'd watched the farm girl lift her arm over her head. He'd asked Cora 3 questions, medical questions, precise ones, and gotten 3 precise answers. Now he stood at the front of the hall, and the town waited for the state to tell it what to do. "I'll be plain," Renner said, "because I haven't the time to be anything else. You've got a polio epidemic in this valley and a hospital that's full. That's the bad news, and you know it already." He let that sit. "Here's the news you don't know. There is a woman living at the edge of your town who is treating these children with a method developed by Sister Elizabeth Kenny, a method taught in Minneapolis and studied by men a good deal smarter than me. A method that is saving the use of arms and legs that the standard casting would have cost these children for the rest of their lives." The hall went dead silent. "I've seen her charts. I've seen her patients move limbs I'd have bet a year's pay were finished. This is not," and here he looked around the room hard, "this is not kitchen medicine. This is not folk cure. This is recognized treatment, done correctly, by someone properly trained to do it." He turned. "Mrs. Whitfield, where did you train?" Cora stood near the back, where the widow stood now, out of the way. Every face in the hall turned to her. "Minneapolis," she said. "In 43. Under the Kenny instruction? Yes, certified?" "Certificate of instruction," Cora said. 1943. Renner nodded slowly, and he turned back to the room, and he found Pruitt in the second row. "Dr. Pruitt, you've got more sick children than you have hands or beds. This woman has the training and the results and the room. I'm recommending, as the state, that you work with her, not against her. Route your hot pack cases to her. Learn the method from her. That's not a small thing I'm saying to a county physician, and I know it. But I've seen both wards this morning, son, and I know which one I'd carry my own boy to." You could have heard a pin drop on the plank floor. And Pruitt stood up, 34 years old, city-credentialed, and it cost him everything he had, but he stood up in front of the 40-odd neighbors he'd spoken to in June, and he did not defend himself, and he did not explain. He turned to the back of the hall, to the widow, and he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I've got a ward full of children I may have set stiff for life, because I was certain I was right." His voice was steady, but it wasn't easy. "Will you teach my nurses the packs? Will you show us how it's done?" And Cora Whitfield looked at the young man who had shamed her in this very room, and she did not make him crawl. And she did not throw a single word of it back in his face. She had a coffee can at home full of debts she'd never collected. She wasn't going to start collecting now. "I will," she said. "We start tonight. Bring your nurses to my kitchen at dark." Then she reached into the black bag she had carried down the aisle, her husband's bag, open now, in use, and she drew out a folded square of clean wool, and she walked up the aisle through the parted crowd, and she put it in the young doctor's hands. "Here," she said. "This is where you start. Learn the heat of it first. Everything else follows the heat." Now, a town that has been wrong out loud has a hard time being right quietly, and Bishop Creek was no different. It came to her door the only way pride will, a little at a time, hat in hand, at dusk when the neighbors couldn't quite see each other's faces. Through the last weeks of that polio summer, they lined the walk to the Whitfield porch, fathers carrying stiff-legged children, mothers with feverish babies. And some of them, this is the part the girl Junie never forgot, some of them were the very ones who had signed the council notice. the ones who'd murmured agreement in June. They came up the same walk where the bottle had shattered, and they stood on the same porch she had swept clean of glass, and they said low, "Mrs. Whitfield, it's my Tommy. It's his leg." And she took each child in. Every single one. She did not say, "I remember your name" on that notice. She did not say, "Your kind threw a bottle at my door." She said, "Bring him to the kitchen." Quick now, the same words, every time, for the neighbors who'd scorned her and the strangers alike. Junie asked her about it once, wringing wool at the counter. "Doesn't it make you want to say something? To them? After everything?" Cora considered it. "Saying something is for people who need to be paid back," she said. "I don't need paying back. I need this boy's foot to move." She laid a pack. "Respect you have to squeeze out of people isn't worth having, child. The kind that comes on its own when you're just doing your work, that's the only kind that keeps." And the state made it official, the way the state does, in a meeting, with papers. Renner's recommendation went through, and the county routed its polio cases to the Whitfield Clinic, and this was the thing that made the Marshes weep at their own kitchen table. The county covered the cost of it under the health emergency. The $200. The ambulance fee. The $22 a week for a bed. Waived, all of it, for the hot pack cases sent to Cora. The very money that had turned Petey away from the ward and sent Junie running through the corn to a dark porch. The county paid it now, to the woman they'd forbidden to practice. And in that same meeting, the plain arithmetic caught up with Emmett Doss. Because Renner, going down the county's list of approved remedies, came to Doss's patent tonics, the cure-alls, the fever waters, the whole shelf the druggist had been protecting all along, and he struck them off. "These don't treat anything," Renner said, mild as milk. They never did. "We can't have a county list carrying cures that don't cure, not in the middle of an epidemic. Pull them." And that was all it took. No speech, no accusation, no revenge. Just a state officer with a pen, and the plain fact of who had actually healed the valley's children, and who had sold it colored water. Doss sat in the third row, with his standing coming apart around him, and there was nobody to blame it on this time. He had built the widow's ruin out of a grieving mother's words to save his ledger. And now, his ledger fell anyway, by its own weight, by the arithmetic he'd started. Not her doing, his own. He got up before the meeting ended, and he went out the side, and the neighbors watched him go, and something in the town's face had turned all the way around. October came, and the fevers passed, the way they do, the disease burning down to embers and then to nothing, leaving the valley quieter and changed. There was a new sign on the Whitfield house. Cora had let Junie talk her into it. It hung by the front walk, freshly painted, and it said Dr. Samuel Whitfield at the top, because she would never take his name down. And beneath it, smaller but clear, C. Whitfield, R.N. The county's referred clinic. Her name, just her name, which was all she'd ever wanted back. Inside, on the kitchen shelf, the flour tins had been moved, and the frame that had faced the wall for 3 years faced the room now. Junie had done it herself, one afternoon, on her own, without asking, reached up and turned it around so the next mother through the door would see it plain. Cora's nursing certificate, and beside it, the other one. Certificate of Instruction, Kenny Clinic, Minneapolis, 1943. She'd let the girl leave them turned out. It was time. Junie wore a nurse's apron now, and she learned at the table 3 afternoons a week, wringing wool, keeping the charts, her hands getting surer every day. She was going to be good. Cora could see it. The town's proxy, the frightened girl from the dark porch, learning to be a pair of steady hands herself. Out in the yard, in the low honey-colored light of an October afternoon, Petey Marsh ran. Not limped. Ran, hollering, chasing a dog through the fallen leaves on two good legs, a foot that curled on command, and a boy who would never know how close it had come. Because a woman had been up all night in July, laying hot wool on him, before the fourth-day door swung shut. Down at the county surgery, Dr. Lyle Pruitt had taken to writing 3 words on his own charts, in his own tight hand, when a polio case came in. Consult Mrs. Whitfield, he never made a speech about it. He just wrote it, and sent them out the road to her, and learned the packs alongside his nurses in her kitchen. That was his apology, and she took it as one. And Emmett Doss crossed the street these days rather than pass the Whitfield porch. Couldn't meet her eye. She never troubled him about it. She'd nod, if she happened to catch him, the same nod she gave everyone. That was worse for him than any word she could have said, and they both knew it, and neither one ever mentioned it. By the door of the clinic now, where anyone coming in could see it, sat the black medical bag. Open, in daily use. Samuel's old stethoscope coiled inside it, and beside it a newer one, hers, the two of them side by side the way the two of them had worked this valley for 30 years before the town decided a widow was just a widow. You want to know the truth of it? Plain as Cora would say it? A town can forget what a pair of steady hands is worth. It can talk itself into calling skill a fraud, if there's $1 in the talking and a grief to hang it on. It can turn a good woman's diploma to the wall and make her ashamed to hang it. It can do all of that, and feel righteous doing it, right up until the summer it can't afford to. Right up until the fever comes and the ward fills, and the only light still on is the one at the edge of town. Over the door they told her to close. Bishop Creek learned it the hardest way a town can. And Cora Whitfield never took one thing back but her name. If a Cora ever saved your family, a nurse, a granny, a neighbor with steady hands the world forgot to thank, tell us her name in the comments, and the town you're watching from. The smaller the better. I'd like to see just how far a story like this one travels.